From the Columbia University Language Resource Center, this is Said and Done, the podcast about languages and the people who speak them. This is Said and Done. I'm Chris Kaiser, and joining me today is Professor Nandi Sipengane, who teaches isiZulu, the Zulu language, at Yale University. In this conversation, we talk about how she spoke many different languages at home and at school growing up in South Africa, including isiZulu. She describes some of the unique features of this language, including the famous click consonants. We then discuss how South Africans think about and understand their complex national, cultural, and linguistic identities. Here's my conversation with Nandi Sipengane. Professor Nandi Sipengane, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. I was wondering if we could start off by talking a little bit about how you grew up and where you grew up and what some of the languages that you spoke growing up were.
All right. Well, Professor Kaiser, thank you likewise. It is lovely to join you in the space. I am honored to grace your presence in the space, and hopefully this will be a very good conversation. I look forward to your questions and how we are going to just unpack different aspects of the conversation on this podcast. About myself and my background, I am from South Africa. South Africa in the Eastern Cape region originally. That's where I was born, in a small town called Bizana, a rural town called Bizana, which borders the KwaZulu-Natal region of South Africa and the Eastern Cape region, but we fall under the Eastern Cape. I grew up speaking Xhosa. My parents are one of them is Xhosa speaking, and then one of them is Zulu speaking. But predominantly at home, we spoke Xhosa as the mother tongue. Obviously, like, your mother has more influence in the family household, and so like the family tends to go that route. But I identify as both Zulu and I identify as both Xhosa as well because of that divide. I grew up speaking Xhosa. I remember the first language that I learned how to write and obviously speak was Xhosa from my childhood. I spent my early years in the Eastern Cape living with my grandmother, and pretty much teaching in school, primary school, preschool was in Xhosa. And so that's where I started reading and writing, of course. And then from around 3rd to 4th grade, I then moved with my parents, who were now based in the Gauteng province. Some people say Johannesburg area, and in the city of Pretoria is where they were based, and I moved with them. And then from there on, of course, it's bigger. There are more people in the city from different regions of the country, and there are more languages. But then that's where I got then introduced to English as a language. And I spoke English from there. I spoke Sotho. I spoke Afrikaans, or rather I learned Afrikaans. Let me rather say I learned them rather than saying I spoke them. That's where I got introduced to them. Sotho, English, and Afrikaans. That's where I spent most of my primary years, high school years, and higher level education, like your tertiary institution, undergrad, pretty much. And yeah. Oh, also, I did forget to mention this. This is the ones that I just mentioned right now: Xhosa, Zulu, Sotho, English, Afrikaans. Those are your official languages. But then there are other languages that aren't on the official language chart, And the language spoken in the region that I was raised or brought up in the Eastern Cape when I was a kid was Mpondo. It is not in the 11 official language group of South Africa. However, it is a language that people speak in that region. And I also do know that language.
Wow, that's so many languages to grow up with. I mean, I guess one question I have before I ask you about some of the specific languages is, how did you get all these languages into your head? How do you keep them straight? What is it like growing up in such a rich multilingual environment?
Yeah. Well, for the most part of it in South Africa, it's quite a normal experience for one to speak all these languages. And I also guess like your age plays a factor. The fact that when you're young, it's so easy to absorb as many languages as possible. And so if you are in these different environments and you are interacting with these different people, it's pretty normal for one to learn and pick up language format so easily. And so I was privileged to grow up in such a society that allows that to happen. And we're also just like very culturally and linguistically diverse. And I think more in your urban spaces, places like your Johannesburg, your Cape Town, it opens up more opportunities for you to learn more languages, because that's the hub for business, and that's where people go for, I guess, to better their education and to find job opportunities. And yeah, and it's also very common for one to be raised in a home whereby parents are from different cultural groups, and so a child can speak their mom's language and their dad's language and so forth. And then in addition to that, if the space you relocate to uses a different language, the kids that you interact with growing up, you're bound to pick that up. And so it's a privilege also to come from such a background that is just so rich in language and culture and diverse as well in that sense.
So you mentioned that your mother and your household was in Osa. I can't pronounce that word very well. I'm sorry.
Very well pronounced, Chris.
Now, what about when you're interacting with your peers and your friends outside of a formal context, just at their homes or, out and about? What language would you speak with your age mates, when there's no adult supervision?
Yeah. I would say for the most part, we tend to interact in English, especially if we're so diverse. Perhaps maybe I've got a friend who speaks Afrikaans and maybe one who speaks Sotho, and it's so different. And we can then use English as the language for substitution or to interact. However, South Africa's lingua franca is Zulu, especially for the Black population. And so in a space where I'm interacting with other young Black children and we're playing or we're socializing outside of a home space or outside of a classroom space, then Zulu tends to be one of the languages that unify people in South Africa. And it just so goes to other social spaces as well. When you grow up and you're interacting with people, it's one of the languages that unifies people from different backgrounds, cultural backgrounds and linguistic backgrounds.
Yeah. Oh, that makes sense. So was that also the case when you were maybe like 8 or 9 or 10 years old? Would you speak in Zulu with the people in your community, or would you speak another language with them in that context?
That's a very good question. It depends where I am. So it depends where I am. If I find myself, this is now the younger version of myself. If I find myself in a school playground at school, I would probably speak in English depending on who I'm interacting with at that moment. If I find myself at home with a different group of friends, I could find myself interacting with them in Sotho. It also depends on what region I am in. So if I am in the Eastern Cape, that's where I was born and spent like part of my childhood, I would interact with my peers there and at that time in Mpondo or Xhosa. So also depending on what region. And in addition to that, since my family is diverse in that sense, depending on which side of the family I'm visiting. If I'm visiting my dad's side of the family, the majority of them are Zulu speakers. And so if I find myself visiting them maybe over the school holidays, I will try to interact with them in Zulu. So my tongue just kind of like switches depending on what area I'm in or who I'm interacting with at that time.
Gotcha. Do you have kind of a metaphor for yourself for your own multilingualism in the sense like is it like a shelf and you just pull out whatever language you need at a given moment? How do you conceptualize your multilingualism? How do you think about it?
That's really an interesting question. I've never really thought about it in that sense, like how I would identify this. I might want to. I might want to think about it a little bit, but I guess I'm an absorber, like a sponge. I just take it all in and use it. I love language, and so I guess I'm a sponge. I take it, absorb it, and use it. Maybe that's the metaphor I want to use. Yeah, and I'm really just very much interested about people, like where they from, like what their cultures are like and what it represents. And I'm very much open to like learning about those people's backgrounds. And so I'm a sponge in a way. Yeah. And that's the metaphor I'd use right now. Just thinking on the spot.
Well, I think often the first, when somebody says, "What's your metaphor for X?" Usually the first response is the true one.
Yeah.
Now, there are two languages that you mentioned that I've not been familiar with and other people might not be familiar with, which are Mpondo and Sotho. Can you talk about what those languages are, maybe how they fit in with what language family they belong to, who speaks those languages?
These are also Bantu languages, and Bantu languages obviously stem from Niger, Congo, and like I don't have the answers of how people then migrated and dispersed into different regions. But these are Bantu languages that are spoken in different provinces in South Africa, or for people who are not familiar with provinces, I would say different regions in South Africa. And I guess they fall part, not even guess, they do fall part of the Bantu languages. And the Mpondo leans more towards Xhosa, but it is a language on its own. It's not a dialect, it's a language on its own. And Sotho is from Lesotho. But if you look at our map in South Africa, it is literally in the region itself. And so you can imagine, because of job opportunities and seeking and travel, like people obviously get out of their hometowns and out of their cities, and it becomes bigger and they interact with people outside themselves. And so that's just how I grab the language as well.
So these two languages, Mpondo and Sotho, they are related to Zulu and Xhosa as well.
To some extent, Sotho does have some of the click consonants that could be found in the Zulu language. However, I would say that Sotho is a bit different from that. But I would say then the Mpondo, Xhosa, and Zulu are a bit more similar in form of structure and how it's spoken and how it's written, where the stress is put when you're writing, whereas Sotho still uses a Latin writing system. It still has like some click consonant sounds, but it sounds a bit more different from Xhosa, Zulu, and Mpondo.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So since we're speaking about language, you're a teacher of Zulu at Yale University.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if can we talk a little bit about Zulu?
Yeah, please go ahead.
My first question is, a lot of times you'll see Zulu or you'll see isiZulu. And what does that mean?
Well, good question, Chris. This is an ongoing conversation between language purists versus non-language purists. Let me try to break it down a little. So Zulu would be your root word, right? And isiZulu, the isi part would be your prefix. Now, if I'm speaking in my target language and I say I speak isiZulu, what I'm trying to say is that I speak the Zulu language. So that prefix kind of serves the same function as an article, the Zulu language. And so with language purists, I think they debate is that you don't just speak Zulu, you speak the Zulu language, so put an article to it, because that's how we would say it when we're speaking in our own home languages, or in our own languages rather. And so there's also a different perspective to it, how I also look at it. I don't really care which one comes out. So if I say I teach isiZulu versus I teach Zulu, for me, it's the same, but I am aware of the distinctions that could be made or that could come up from that. With one saying that they teach Zulu, it's a bit broad when you just put it like that. So if you teach Zulu, you could be teaching the cultural aspects of Zulu. Are you teaching the linguistic aspects of Zulu? Are you teaching me about the Zulu people? So it can be broad. But if you are then saying I'm teaching isiZulu, then it can be very specific that, definitely it's the language that she is focused on or that he is focused on.
So isiZulu really just means the Zulu language.
Right. If I am to break it down like that, or if I'm to simplify it as to the distinction between the two.
Whereas Zulu could mean the Zulu people, it could mean Zulu anything.
Yeah, Zulu anything, Zulu language, Zulu culture, like Zulu people, like what are we studying here,
Okay. Yeah. So you would never say isiZulu language because that'd be Zulu language.
Yeah.
But you could say
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's true.
So can we talk a bit about just the basics of this language? Where is it spoken? How many people speak it? And also, you alluded to this earlier, but also what kind of language is Zulu language?
Right. I did touch on the fact that it's a Bantu language, and that obviously it stems from Central Africa, which is Niger Congo, which is where like more than 600 plus Bantu languages stemmed from or came from or emerged from. And obviously people went into different regions. Some people are in Kenya speaking Kiswahili. Some people are in Malawi speaking a different language there. And some people went further down, which is where we find Zulu speakers. And so it is a family of the Bantu language in that sense. And it has remnants of the Khoisan, because when Zulu people came down to Southern African region, we found the indigenous people of Southern Africa, which are the Khoisan people. And the linguistic elements of the Khoisan language is that it comprises of click sounds. And so the first people that they interacted with or intermingled with or intermarried with are Xhosa people. And I think that then had an influence because the Zulu people were in your upper region of Southern Africa, and the Khoisan were on the most southeastern region of South Africa. And so that's where the Xhosa people are. They're in the most southern eastern. So I'm trying to just imagine or picture it in my head how then language maybe might have moved, or the influence of the click consonant sounds might have moved. And so if you look at like people moving and people interacting and how language can sort of like spill onto the next language. So I think it kind of is that dynamic with isiZulu. And so in simple terms, we then adapted our sounds with the Khoisan click consonants. Zulu is a simple language. It uses the Latin writing system. So it's quite easy for one who is writing and reading in English to be able to read and write in isiZulu if you're introduced to it, obviously in the formal sense, and you're able to get the basics of that. So definitely we're using the alphabet system that we use in Latin or in English. And of course, the click consonant sounds, what is represented as a C, as a Q, and an X has its own definition in the Zulu language. So if I'm to divide those, the C represents a dental sound, which is, I'll just say it or just do the sound for you to hear. It's presented as a, so that's the dental click sound. That's the first main click consonant that we have. And I'm obviously doing them in the order of the alphabet. And then we've got an alveolar sound. So this dental sound, just imagine a baby sucking on milk or in a milk bottle. You're just, that's the C sound. And then the Q sound, which is the alveolar sound, is the, that sounds like a champagne bottle popping. Yeah. And then the last click consonant sound is the lateral click consonant sound. So what you do is that you're pressing your tongue onto the sides of your, like everything is inner, of course, side ridges of your teeth, and you're just going, sounds like horse riding.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, like these comparisons or these ways that I'm teaching you how to say it is how I usually introduce it in my class as well. And so these sounds can be used, obviously, to make up a word if combined with other vowel sounds and other consonant sounds. And sometimes if combined with other consonant sounds, it could even form like a deeper sound. So if you form, for instance, a G, C, it then takes a deeper form. So it becomes the, instead of, if you're forming maybe a GQ, it becomes the. It forms a deeper tone than just etc., etc. So I'm sure you can hear that. And so, yeah, that's the language. And as I mentioned before, it's the lingua franca of South Africa. So we use it as a language bridge between people in the Southern African region. And you did also ask about where else it is spoken and maybe how many other speakers of the language there are. Currently, if I'm looking at the census, just looking at like population statistics of South Africa, we're approximately 61 million as of this year, 61 million plus. So just also, I'm not very accurate in that, but I do know at least that we're around that number.
That's a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot of people. I was really shocked. And when looking at the Zulu population, I think 24% of that number, of that 61 million, speak isiZulu. And so that's around, if I'm getting my maths numbers right, that's around 14 million plus people who speak the language in the Southern African region. And 11 million of those people are divided into two spaces. Gauteng region, which people tend to call your Johannesburg region, and your KwaZulu-Natal region. I'm obviously not sure, like, then how the statistics then divide further on. Like, okay, out of that 11%, this much percentage is based in KwaZulu-Natal versus this much percent is based in Cape Town or Johannesburg, vice versa. And so that's quite a huge number. You're right. Now it hits me, like the moment I start talking about it, that, wow, yeah, that's a huge number of speakers. And then, of course, in your bordering countries within the Southern African region, like your Malawi, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, just to mention a few, Botswana, there are people in those regions who do speak Zulu, of course. And then, of course, in the diaspora, like in the UK, in the United States, there are other people who then migrated and they speak Zulu language. But those are just like the stats that I've got in my mind right now of like the people representative, of course, of the language in the country or in the region versus outside.
So, given that it really is such a large population, you can understand why people might want to study this language.
Yeah.
And it's also, it seems, a language that can be used with a large population, even if that population isn't speaking Zulu at home as their everyday language. It's a language that many people understand.
Yeah. Yeah.
One thing, so I think everybody's fascinated by the clicks. It's so cool, and not too many languages have clicks. When you were doing it, I think I can do the dental click and I can do the lateral click, but I cannot do the alveolar click.
The alveolar, just put your tongue at the roof of your mouth and
no.
Yes, that one. But of course, it takes practice.
I would have to practice.
Yeah, for such things to happen, for people to, kind of like practice these aspects. I can speak a little bit more about that, but yeah.
So the way that you and I know each other is that you teach through the Shared Course Initiative, which is a distance collaboration between Columbia, Cornell, and Yale. And so I always hear the Zulu class right outside my office right here. And I can just hear the sound of the class every day, even though you're teaching it at Yale. And I find that it's such a sort of lyrical, musical language. And I was wondering if you feel the same way. Is just the sound of it is really interesting. And also, are there tones in this language? Is it a tonal language, or am I mistaken in perceiving that?
Specifically, I just think people in different regions speak the language differently. So also maybe for emphasis, when one is saying something, maybe they might say it with a different tone. But there aren't markers, just like you would find in the Yoruba language. So we don't have tone markers. It's just a thing of how a person is communicating and what they're communicating and what they wish to stress when they're communicating. And so you are right, it is like a very musical language, but the musical aspect of it is just for me teaching and me just loving music and using music to teach. But it's got nothing to do with me trying to perhaps focus on stressing certain tone aspects of the language. I just think people, depending on what region they are in, maybe their age also determines like what kind of tone they use when they're speaking, vice versa. Yeah.
So how then did you decide to become a teacher of isiZulu? Can you talk a little bit about the path that you took to becoming a teacher of this language?
I've always wanted to be a teacher. So it's one of those things that stem from childhood. Like when you look at a child and you see certain behavioral patterns, you're just like, oh, okay, maybe she's going to be a teacher. So I've always been that kid who's trying to read to people or like create a classroom setup in a place that is not a classroom for people to learn and engage in that sense. Obviously, these are stories that I hear. It's not something I can remember. But of course, I speak isiZulu at home, and I speak Xhosa as well. And I did say that I also have background with Mpondo language. So how I came about it was this way. I went into the education field, and I definitely wanted to be a teacher, but it's so weird because I didn't focus on being a language teacher when I had first applied. So my majors were in psychology and business economics. And so I went into that space saying that when I come out of this institution, I studied at the University of Pretoria, by the way. So when I came out of that, what I anticipated coming out of that institution was that I'm going to be a business studies / business economics teacher, and that's my major, and that's what I'm going to follow. And then on the side, I will just double major and do psychology, because if you're going to be working with young people, of course, that part of you has to be alert, like the psychological part of it, like because you're dealing with people. And so part of me studying at the University of Pretoria, I had gotten a scholarship to pay for my tuition. And part of the scholarship was that if you are getting the scholarship, you have to take an African or South African language rather, so that if you are then placed into whatever region after you finish your undergrad, you are going to be able to be in a classroom and engage with the students that you're going to teach in English, and also because as the main language of instruction, and also be able to reach those students that you're interacting with in their home language, depending on what region you are placed in. And so I took it as an opportunity. Remember, I had mentioned that in my childhood, the only language I had learned how to read and write, South African language, was Xhosa, or Bantu language was Xhosa. And so since primary, all I had been doing was speaking and interacting with Zulu and Xhosa in the home setting, but in the school setting, it was mainly English and Afrikaans. Those were my subjects, my language subjects, because of the region I was in. And so the curriculum kind of says, pick a home language, but then they make your home language English. And then because there's so many people and there's so many different languages that they have as their home language, it's just like, this is your home language, but then you can choose an additional one to that. And so what was available for me in that region was Afrikaans. And so I was just like, I want to pick Zulu for the scholarship because I want to engage with it a little bit more. I want to learn how to intellectualize a conversation in the language. So maybe it was a rebellion. It was just like, oh, I'm so tired of like Afrikaans and English. Like, let's get these Zulu skills going, you know? And so I then went into that. But also I take pride in my language and my culture. And maybe that's also a motivational aspect of it, that I took that. And I was like, okay, clearly, like if I get placed in the KwaZulu-Natal region or Eastern Cape region, or wherever really that I'm placed, I'll be able to interact with those students that I'm with using isiZulu. Then in my post-grad, I studied at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So this is now fast forward. And I was in the Department of African Languages and Literature there. And part of my study there, another scholarship opportunity to study abroad, I obviously, you know, like you go in with an open mind when you are like getting into your career field, like whatever can happen. I think that's another thing that young people need to take into perspective, that just go with an open mind. It doesn't mean that you have to limit yourself, that no, because I studied this, I majored in psychology, I have to do things related to psychology, or because I did business economics, I have to do things related to that. So I was really open-minded. I was like, okay, yeah, sure. Like I might not be that well versed in languages and literature, but I might learn. And I loved it. I had an amazing supervisor at that university, UW-Madison. And there I got to be in a classroom and I was pretty much in charge. I think that's the amazing thing about the program. So you are a student, an MA student, you could be a PhD student, but the language classrooms, you are in charge. So you better not lie on your CV or in your application when you say that you are a teacher, you've got a teaching background, or that you speak a language, because you will be placed in a classroom and you have to like conduct like you are the professor now. And so that was my foundation of teaching isiZulu. So from learning it in the university level and sort of like getting the linguistic structures of the language besides just speaking it at home. And then now I get to teach it in the classroom. And in my time there as well at UW-Madison, I used to spend a lot of time doing summer programs with the University of Gainesville, Florida. And that's how I also got to teach the language. So it gave me opportunities to teach the language in different spaces with different students. And yeah, and I got to build up on that and develop on that. Fast forward, I move after my post-grad at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I then moved to South Africa. And when I'm in South Africa, there isn't much of a demand for Zulu teachers. And so when I went back there, I was a business studies teacher. So I went back into that, like business economics. And then fast forward maybe to 2020, I then applied for a teaching post here at Yale University, and which has now privileged me to be able to access students at Yale University, like you mentioned, at Columbia University and Cornell University. And that's where I now teach isiZulu from beginning, intermediate, and advanced level.
Well, um, I I get to speak with your students, the ones who are here at Columbia, and they love the class. They're very excited, and sometimes they're a little overly excited, but it's a fun class. It's fun to kind of be a distant auditor of that class. As you were speaking, I did have a question that came up. You know, languages don't exist in a vacuum. They have histories and they have power relationships between one another. And you were saying that, you know, a part of your education was in English and Afrikaans, and then you kind of made the choice to, you know, to really dig into Zulu. And I was wondering, you know, given that English and Afrikaans these are colonial languages in South
Yeah.
Africa, what whether this baggage, whether this history and these dynamics were salient to you as you were making these choices, or not. I'm just kind of curious about that facet of it.
Yeah. Um, Good question. The way the education system is set up in South Africa, they're using, okay, maybe I might not get that deep into it, but they're using the National Curriculum of Assessment Policy Statement, which is called CAPS. That system is from grade R or grade 0 to 12th grade. So what do they call it here in America? Pre-K through
Pre-K,
12.
yeah.
Yes, if I'm saying it right. And so part of that, you have 23 subjects to pick from, like from different schools. Like different regions can have more offerings of subjects versus others. It depends also on the resources of that school and teaching resources and as well. So depending on that, that's a factor. However, I do think these colonial languages had an upper hand in urban spaces. So when I moved to the Johannesburg or Gauteng region and I was schooling in Pretoria, I pretty much did not have a choice with regards to language picking. The schools that I went to did not offer African languages. It was either English, and for the fact that English counted as my home language in that institution, and it was not, is quite disturbing now that I think of it, because it was not my home language, but it was listed that way in this curriculum. And you are definitely right. These colonial languages did take an upper hand in the education system. I think things have improved now, but like, let me just finish off like with that, what I was explaining. And so with me taking English as my home language, and then Afrikaans as my second additional language, I pretty much did not have a choice. Those were the only two language offerings. At some point in my one high school that I attended, there was the option of taking Sotho or Setswana, and then there was no teacher to teach it. So it was just like, oh, okay, then that's not an option then. So I'm pretty much stuck with these two. So with me then going into the tertiary institution and wanting to take my home language was part of that I really want to be able to have an intellectual conversation in my language in the same way that I can maybe go for an interview and interact with the language English and be so proficient in it that I articulate so well and I get my point across. It kind of disturbed me now reflecting back. Of course, back then it was just like, these are the languages available to me, is whatever, I'm just going to do them. But like when I think of it now, I'm like, it's kind of disturbing because that's not my home language. And so for me to be kind of like forced because the system is that way, and it's not a nice thing to reflect back on. And a lot of work is being done now when you are looking at the curriculum. There are more language offerings and they're very intentional about doing so. So within schools, there are resources of people who actually do teach these home languages. So if a school has Zulu, English, Afrikaans, you are then able to choose from whatever you personally prefer. And I wish I had that as a kid. But then good enough, I had that opportunity later on in life. Maybe some people just did not have the choice back then, people prior to me. So yeah, I guess that's the power dynamic of the language. And it's beautiful also to see them introduced now. I was reading, there's a page that I follow. They call themselves Indigenous African Languages. It's a group formed in South Africa. So I follow their Instagram page, and I was reading most recently that they started introducing the Khoisan language into some African school. And imagine, like, the Khoisan people are the first inhabitants of South Africa. Those are the people that we found there. And to think that their language is facing extinction, it's not even an official language of South Africa. That's quite disturbing on its own. So it's beautiful to see these transformations taking place right now. And yeah, so perhaps we are going to have a generation that like takes pride in their real home languages, and a generation that is able to articulate in their home languages or in African languages in that sense. And my parents also emphasized that I'm from a generation or from a home background that is obviously very rich in culture and language. And my parents made sure that when they interacted with us at home, this is me and my siblings now, we interacted in our African languages, in Zulu or Xhosa at home. I could switch into whatever I want to switch into right now, but I hardly spoke to my parents in English. I'm doing so now just because I can, but if I am put in a serious conversation with people who might not be able to articulate maybe in the same way that I do, maybe the older generation or grandparents in the rural setting, I'm able to get my point across using my own African language. And yeah, I feel sort of like a shame for Africans or South Africans who are pushing their children to learn English only, and because that will then be very limiting later on with what the child can do in that space and in the broader space as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you've demonstrated, you can have so many different languages working at once in your mind. And also you're one of the people that I think who's contributing to the positive use of Zulu, of home languages, that teaching this language at a high level, at the educated level. And I think that's pretty cool.
Thank you.
Yeah. I wanted to kind of ask you, what are some of the identity dynamics going on among young people in South Africa? How do they see themselves, and how do they, maybe within the country, and how do they see themselves kind of with respect to the rest of the world? It's kind of an open question, but I kind of wonder if you could reflect for a second on that general question, even though I don't know the specifics.
Yeah. Oh, that's also a very good question. You're asking me very good questions. Obviously, I can first say that societies are very stratified. There are different layers into it with regards to identity. So, like, different layers could play into like the aspect of how people see themselves or how people identify themselves. There are social aspects to it. There are political aspects, cultural, economic aspects to it. And obviously those have set a precedence on how people then see themselves in relation to the world or to themselves as a people of a country. But for the most part of it, young South African people, or rather South African people in the general sense, I would describe them as warm, patient, creative people. Hence, you are getting a taste of amapiano as a music genre. Like, when we do something, we commit to it and we go in hard, and the rest of the world needs to see it. We take pride in our arts, in our culture, and how we present ourselves to the rest of the world. it's a country full of charisma, like very charismatic people. I listen to a lot of stand-up comedy, and one of my favorite South African comedians in the diaspora is Trevor Noah. And he often like made a joke in some of his sets about how South African people will dance even when faced with like very like harsh times, even if it's like harsh times in terms of politics or just how things are taking shape or changing in society. How they deal with it is through comedy, music, dance, and maybe that's our coping mechanism to maybe many other things. But we are also very culturally diverse, and we're very much aware of that diversity within our space. We are from different tribes. I'm not sure if it's okay for me to say tribes in America, but in South Africa, we do say like I'm from this tribe or I'm from this cultural groups. I think the more appropriate term is cultural group in America. But yeah, we are from different tribes, and we take those cultural groups or those tribes as our main form of identity, like how we identify ourselves. So we could be from the same country and be same race, Black, and we could be identifying differently as a people, and we could really respectfully so say, I'm not affiliated with Tswana people because I am Xhosa, and these are the social norms in my space, and these are the values, or these are the nuances of our people. But all in all, we are one as a people. And I think another thing is that with languages and culture and all of these other beautiful things that I mentioned, there's also the spirit of Ubuntu. Ubuntu is a South African concept that states that I am because you are. That means in a world, you don't just exist alone. You don't just do things alone. It's communal living, like you're interacting with people, you learn, you grow, you engage with other people. You need other people. And so, yeah, that's how people identify, I could say. And also, like coming into America as a space, people tend to throw the phrase, oh, you're African, or I'm African. So it could go both ways if you just want to generalize. But I just want to specify that it's a lot nicer to know that I'm African, yes, from the continent. But then on top of that, or going into depth, I am South African. But then also on top of that, going into depth, I am Zulu, I'm Venda, I am Afrikaans, I am, Sotho, etc., etc.
And of all of these identities, would you say that the ethnic group identity or the linguistic identity is the one that's most salient to people, the one that kind of is the locus of how they construct their lives?
Yes, I would say that. I would say cultural aspects is the main form of identity, like how people identify. And then, of course, with culture comes language as well, or with language comes culture. These things sort of like interplay into each other in that way. Yeah. So if we're narrowing it down, that's then how it then boils down at the end of the day. It's your people, your culture.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned the concept of Ubuntu, which I think many Americans may have heard of or have some idea of. Can you give an example of how it exists in an applied sense, something that you would do referring to this concept?
I will make an example I'm pretty sure like different societies have got their own versions of Ubuntu and what that means to them. That's how we coin it. But like I mentioned, it's the sense that you need other people, like we need each other. You do not exist in a world alone. And so that is what the spirit of Ubuntu is about. And so if I'm to make a practical example of it, if you are coming to South Africa and whether I know you or I don't know you, I would like to extend some kindness and show you a warm welcome. Of course, like hoping that you've never done anything bad to me, I will extend my home to you, in the sense that you're welcome here. I'll cook for you. I'll welcome you to make sure that you are as comfortable as possible, and that you know and you sense it and you feel welcome in that space. So vice versa, if I've got a South African coming into America and they're visiting me, I want them to know that, listen, you are home. Like, I am home to you in this space. And if you ever need anything, I mean it in the truest sense, that I will be there for you. I will show up for you whenever you do need me. So that's the most simplified version of it. I guess people can then go into depth and like show how they show the spirit of Ubuntu. It applies into different contexts, different situations for different people.
Well, I think we could go on into much greater depth, but I think we should finish right here. Otherwise, we'll go on forever. And so, Nandi, thank you so much for speaking with me today. I really appreciated this conversation.
Thank you. This was really fruitful. And like I said, I hope this podcast is going to reach a number of people who are interested in learning about the language and the culture and just South Africa as well. Not only in Cornell, Columbia, and Yale, but perhaps in the diaspora at large and in the continent as well. Hopefully it will reach those people. And yeah, I'm open to more conversations that we can touch on in the future.
Absolutely.
But thank you as well for your time.
Thank you.